Does a world champion speech have to be funny? Technically, no. But what you'll often find is that the winning speech at the World Championship at Public Speaking often has a fair bit of humor in it. And the speech we're going to look at today is often regarded by folks as one of the funniest world champion speeches. Today we're going to be looking at the 2001 World Championship speech, Ouch, by Darren LaCroix. And before we get into this, I actually want to give a little bit of a thank you to Darren. When I first started making these World Championship analysis speeches, I got the approach and the format wrong. And Darren actually saw one of my videos and he had this really nice, respectful conversation with me, gave me some advice, gave me some ideas, and that's really helped to inform the format and the approach that I take with these videos nowadays. So I want to say thank you to Darren if he's watching this, and also acknowledge that what you're watching now, in terms of not just the speech of Darren, but actually the whole analysis that we do in this video, is actually very much informed by Darren. The footage that I'm going to be using today is from Toastmasters International, but it's actually on Darren's personal channel. So again, I want to give a thank you to Darren for being able to use this footage today. And the use of this footage is not for commercial purposes, it's for informational and educational purposes only. With that in mind, let's now look at the World Championship speech 2001, Ouch, by Darren LaCroix.
Enthusiasm until finally it shouted, "Yeah, great idea, but what if you fall on your face?"
So this is the iconic part of the speech. This is the thing that people always talk about when they're referencing the speech. The fact that Darren fell on his face, literally, in his speech. And we're going to talk a lot more about this particular aspect of the speech, but just a little bit of behind the scenes stuff. So I listened to Darren speak about this speech on his podcast. I'd highly recommend going and listening to his podcast. And he said in order to do this, he put knee pads on his knees so that he could fall on his knees easier. So that's a nice little bit of behind the scenes in terms of thinking about, well, how are you going to dress on stage? And it's these little things, thinking about, well, what are some additions that I need to make to my dress? How I'm dressed going to play into my speech? So it's a small detail, but can you imagine trying to do that without some kind of cushioning? You could maybe pull it off once if you're lucky, but in order to be able to continuously practice this speech, continuously execute this move, you've got to think about how you can do that strategically, because you don't want to be 40 seconds into your speech, fall over and really injure yourself and not be able to do the speech. Let's have a look at a little bit more of what Darren is doing with this particular aspect of the speech.
What do you do when you fall on your face? Do you try and jump right up and hope no one noticed?
So here we have some humor being laid in, and as I said in the introduction to this video, this is remembered as one of the funniest World Championship speeches. So we've already got a little bit of the humor of someone actually falling on their face on stage. And as Darren will tell you later in this speech, he has a background in stand-up comedy. And the key to stand-up comedy is about layering your humor, is about having the follow-up joke. So you get the first line and the first laugh, but then you try to squeeze the fruit for all it's worth. So Darren's already got a bit of a laugh by falling over, but then he says this line about hoping that no one noticed, and that gets a bigger laugh because he's doing the direct opposite of that just now, isn't he? He's lying there, not trying to get up. And again, we're going to talk a little bit more about that dynamic as we go through this video.
Mr. Contest Chair.
So addressing the contest chair is one of the tropes of Toastmasters. You either say Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters, welcome guests, or if you're in a contest, you say contest chair, friends, and then there's normally some kind of extra gag that you add in. And Darren's about to do that. But what we see here with the contest chair is he doesn't stand up to do this ceremonial stuff. He's still lying down and addresses the contest chair. So again, we're seeing some more humor layered in here. Now let's see this that he does, because this plays into what we're talking about with this ceremonial approach and how Darren has his own particular twist on it.
Friends, and the people way in the back.
The people way in the back. So I've heard Darren speak about this aspect of his speech, and he was trying to think of a way that he could make sure all of the audience was engaged. Because when he falls on the floor, he removes a lot of vision. There are people at the back who potentially can't see him on stage at the moment. Now remember, this is 2001. I believe there aren't any big screens either side of the stage, not like you'd have nowadays with more advanced technology. I think they could do it at this time, but I just don't think they actually had these screens. Now, I wasn't there at the actual event, that might be different. But say you don't have those big screens with a camera fixed on the stage. Well, you're relying entirely on people being able to see through their natural vision. And when you are prone on the stage, people near the front aren't really going to be able to see you either. So what Darren wanted to do at this moment was recognize that some people further back in the audience may have been disengaged. So he wanted to re-engage them then, the people all the way up in the back. So that was his particular take on something that's usually quite ceremonial and formulaic of contest chair, friends, and then add a funny addition here. That was how Darren played with this in this particular skit.
Ouch!
So now we see the conclusion of this falling flat on the face skit. Darren was lying down for 35 seconds. He fell over at 40 seconds as we're watching this video. And he's now getting up at 1 minute 15. And that's when he says, ouch, the buzzword, the title of the speech. So this is a long addition to the speech. So you've got to make sure that you're really pulling off. If you're doing anything for 35 seconds in a 7-minute speech, you've got to make sure that it is really adding to the speech. And the different layers and components that we've talked about so far in the video are the ways that Darren made sure it was valuable, it was worth that time. And we're going to see one more final reference to it in a couple seconds time.
Did you feel I stayed down too long?
Did you feel I stayed down too long? This is great mind reading from Darren. When Darren was practicing and delivering this speech, and as he says, actually at the end of this video, if you go and watch all of the speech, Darren has a little bit at the end talking about it, and he also talks about it again more on this podcast. When he was practicing this speech, so many people said the falling down thing is funny, but you're doing it for too long. And so Darren thought about this, he took this feedback, he spoke with his coach, Mark Brown, who also hosts the podcast with him, and they decided that because people were saying he was doing it for too long, he was going to do it for longer. He was going to make it really uncomfortable for people, but not really uncomfortable for people to niggle them and frustrate them, really uncomfortable to make a point. And so when he comes up and says, do you feel I stayed down too long? The audience go, yeah, actually, I kind of felt that you did. It made me feel a bit uncomfortable. So what Darren is doing there with that mind reading of knowing what the audience are thinking, because he's practiced this speech loads and he's got that feedback, by showing he knows what the audience is thinking, he's starting to develop that empathy and connection with the audience, where the audience feel, oh, this speaker understands me. This speaker gets me. He knew that I found that too long and a little bit uncomfortable. And with that empathy, then comes Darren's next line. Listen to this.
Have you ever stayed down too long?
Now we get the serious point. So all of this has been very funny, very showmanship, falling over and cracking gags. But now Darren gets the serious point out of it. Do you feel you've stayed down too long? Have you ever been uncomfortable at someone staying down too long. But not the speaker on stage, not me, you. And that's the whole reason why Darren does this extended skit, why he stays down for that uncomfortably long time, why he cracks all those jokes and gets those gags and gets that connection with the audience, because he wants them to hear that serious point. Because after people laugh, they listen. And Darren wants to make sure that one statement is heard and listened to. Do you feel you've stayed down too long? Now the audience gets why this speech is for them. This speech is for you. If you feel you've fallen flat on your face, if you feel that you've been stuck down too long, if you felt embarrassed, humiliated, you've had regrets, this speech is for you. And everything that Darren has been doing in this opening just over a minute has been about building that connection and helping the audience to hear, why should I listen? And that first serious statement is the pinnacle of all of that work. All of the showmanship and the humor and the connection and the empathy building is to get them to hear that one thing, to dial them into the speech and get ready to hear its underlying message.
School, I went out and I went for the American dream. I bought a Subway sandwich shop.
Subway sandwich shop, nice little bit of alliteration. We're hearing that same sound coming through. And that alliteration captures people's attention. When we hear that repetition of sounds, it sparks our brain and we go, oh, that's intriguing, what's that? And we focus on it. And as we're focusing on it, this is what we hear next.
Oh yeah. You're all impressed, I can tell. I don't want to brag or anything, but in 6 short months, I took a $60,000 debt, and I doubled that debt.
So now we hear the humor again. But this type of humor, this self-deprecating humor, it's relatable. We start to warm to the speaker, in this case, Darren. So he's used that alliteration to pull the attention. Okay, listen to this thing next. Then he's followed this up with some self-deprecating humor. That self-deprecating humor takes him off a pedestal, makes him relatable, because before we listen to someone, we want to like them. And we like people who are relatable. We like people who we feel have the same flaws as us, make the same mistakes as us. And that's what Darren does with this bit of self-deprecating humor. And like all good stand-up comedians, he has a follow-up. Let's hear the follow-up.
That's right, I turned Subway Sandwich Shop into a non-profit organization.
There we go, the follow-up. So he gets that little bit of a gag. You can hear there's like a ripple of laughter throughout as he talks about doubling the debt. But when he talks about turning Subway into a non-profit organization, you can hear the roar of laughter come through. And that's what great humor is all about. Humor is about building momentum. You'll rarely get that burst out, ha 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 ha, laughing with one line. Normally you're going to need 2 or 3 lines to build up that humor. So something that comes across really clearly in this speech, and again, I think this is where Darren's strength with that background of stand-up comedy comes in. He understands about the layering and structure of humor. If you are going to have humor in a speech, having a one-off throwaway line, it's okay, but if you can build it up into a 2 or 3 part joke, that's going to make it so much stronger. It's better to have 1 3-part joke in one part of your speech than 3 throwaway lines scattered throughout the rest of the speech, because those 3 together will do a much greater synergistic work than having those 3 random lines scattered throughout.
I financially fell on my face. But then...
Hear that alliteration again, don't we? Financially fell on my face. So again, using that alliteration to draw the attention. So Darren has bookmarked his humor. So he's used some alliteration at the start to draw the attention in, Subway sandwich shop. And then he's delivered his boom boom couple of jokes. And then he's used alliteration again to draw our focus, not this time to ha ha ha, isn't this funny, but drawing it to that more serious point. I financially fell on my face. So now we're getting back to this core message of the speech, the idea of we make mistakes and we fall down in life. And Darren has returned to that message again. So although we've got loads of humor coming here throughout, he makes sure that when he has that serious statement, he's drawing attention to it. Do you feel you've stayed down too long? I financially fell on my face. That's the serious message that's coming in underneath all this humor. And Darren's using a lot of different techniques to make sure that that underlying message isn't lost under the humor, but the humor is bringing that message to life.
I struggled for an answer and then, bing! I'd be a comedian. But you have to understand my background. I wasn't funny. I wasn't considered a class clown. In fact, the first time my brother ever laughed at me was when I told him I wanted to be a comedian. Ouch!
So in that little passage there, we see more self-deprecating humor. Darren's poking fun at himself, and we see that repetition of the buzzword, ouch. So again, Darren is making himself relatable here. He's making himself likable. So, lightable? Making himself likable. And he's building into his next point of, the serious point behind this is, he does have this dream and he does have this desire to be a comedian. But instead of coming up on stage and saying, I followed my dreams, I followed my passion, I wanted to become a comedian and I became it. That can seem a little bit speaking on the pedestal, can't it? But instead, Darren is still talking about, look, I had this dream as a comedian, but he does it in a self-deprecating way. So we're actually rooting for him to follow his dream as a comedian because he's made it relatable. He's made himself likable. I'm sure there are people in this audience who thought, you know what? I've always thought that I was kind of funny and maybe I could do something with that, but I haven't really. I've maybe done the odd stand-up gig here and there, but I never really went for it. Darren is making that dream relatable to the audience by not delivering it on a pedestal, but by bringing himself down in that fun, relatable way so the audience can hear the seriousness of that message, but they receive it in a way that's palatable to them. When you bring yourself off that pedestal and make yourself relatable, the audience are then ready to hear the serious message that's underneath. And Darren understands that. That's why he takes himself off the pedestal first, makes himself relatable and likable, and then he moves into that serious message and brings the audience along for the journey.
Dr. Goddard's first flight took off in Auburn and landed in Auburn.
Do you hear that change of voice? So Darren speaks in quite a loud and fast way throughout the speech. That's his default speaking range. So anytime we hear a variation from that, it's something that's novel, it draws our attention. And that novelty can be used for humor. So when Darren is bigging up Dr. Goddard, his rocket took off from Auburn, so it's loud and it's dramatic, it's aspirational. And when he switches it to Auburn, that slow and low voice, that's what creates the humor. If he'd gone, it took off in Auburn and landed in Auburn, you wouldn't have the laughter because there wouldn't be the change, there wouldn't be the subversion of expectation. So Darren understands, although he is using the power and energy of his voice throughout his speech, that when you choose strategically to vary it and drop it down, that can create these types of effects. It can create that comedic effect, it can create that focusing effect, it can create that relatable effect. So here we're seeing a different comedic technique. Darren changes his voice to create the laugh.
Seeing me fall on my face and then I come home, Mom, Dad, I want to be a comedian.
What we see from Darren here is he doesn't report the dialogue, he says the dialogue. So he could have said, so my parents are stretching their budget and I came back home and I told them I wanted to be a comedian. Instead, He comes back home, adopts a posture, and he says the dialogue. Mom, Dad, I want to be a comedian. And that delivery of the dialogue makes it funnier because we get taken into that scene and we see the absurdity, the ridiculousness of it, the way that Darren has built up that context. And the punchline is funnier because we hear the dialogue rather than being told about it. Being able to show dialogue in speeches and storytelling is one of the most powerful ways to draw your audience into a scene. Now, it's not something that you do every single time you are talking about people talking. You don't have every person's dialogue come into a speech or story. But when you have a key emotive scene, in this case, the key emotion is actually humor. But when you have a key emotive scene, a way to really connect that emotion and bring it to life is to have us hear the dialogue. It's like watching a movie or a TV show. You hear the dialogue, don't you? You don't get told about the dialogue. Yeah, so this thing happened and this character said that thing to that character. No, you actually see the characters talking. And that's what brings you into the story. The same thing is true in a speech, that when you want to bring your audience into that scene, let them hear the dialogue as it was spoken.
That step, but when that foot lands, you are going to like that feeling. We learn from the ouch. An effort to reach.
We learn from the ouch. Ouch is the title of this speech. It's the buzzword that comes throughout. And we hear Darren say it multiple times throughout the speech. Ouch, 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 ouch. But what he's doing now is he's now adding meaning to that word. We learn from the ouch. What we've been hearing so far is just an exclamation of pain. Ouch. Darren literally falls on the stage. Ouch. His brother makes fun of him for wanting to be a comedian. Ouch. What Darren is doing now is he's creating that reframe for the audience. He's saying, actually, you want to hear that ouch. That ouch shows that you're making progress. It shows that you're trying things. So here we're seeing towards the end of the speech, that meaning and layering of the message being pushed through. Because you want the audience to take home the message. This speech is remembered for being one of the funniest speeches. But this speech wouldn't have won if it was only a funny speech. Because although Darren is a stand-up comedian, we aren't being judged on our ability to make an audience laugh. We're being judged on the ability to teach our audience something. For our audience to take something away from the speech. And so what Darren is doing now is, yes, he's used humor as a tool to underline that message, but now he's starting to hammer home that message. Now he's telling the audience, this is what you need to take away. This is what you need to think about. You learn from the ouch, fall on your face, make mistakes, have failures. That's all part of progressing and growing towards where you want to go.
Dr. Goddard was an ouch master. We need.
You're speaking to a room full of Toastmasters. Anytime that you can make a pun on Toastmaster, playing with the words, is going to get a laugh. So what we're seeing here is audience-specific humor. If Darren is delivering this speech to another audience, they're probably going to appreciate the universal humor that comes in there, the falling on the face, the striving to be a comedian. But that line of being an ouch master, it probably wouldn't get much of a laugh. People might say, oh, it's a cute way of thinking about trying to go after ouches. But because he's speaking to an audience of Toastmasters, that joke lands a lot harder. They get it more. It's an in-joke for them, just like the contest chair, fellow friends, or the people way at the back. So remember that when you're delivering humor in a speech, there is some universal humor that comes in. That whole skit of falling on your face. People are going to get that in different industries, different organizations, different countries. But that line is knowing your audience and thinking about humor that works specifically for them. And that's a way that you can have the same speech that you deliver over and over. I know Darren has delivered this ouch speech lots of times preparing for this World Championship speech, but I know he's also delivered this speech afterwards as well. So you've got to think about, well, when I'm delivering the speech again and again, how do I have a little bit of freshness, a little bit of novelty that's just for that audience I'm delivering it to on that particular day? And that's where you can have these opportunities for audience-specific humor that comes in. You don't build your entire speech around that necessarily, because as soon as you aren't delivering to that audience, you lose all of that relatability. But having those small opportunities to think about, well, what is something that I could say that would relate this speech to this particular audience I'm speaking to? Ouchmaster is an example of how Darren has related this to a Toastmaster audience. He would use something different if he was speaking to a different audience.
But we're so afraid of that ouch, we forget that if we lean forward and take a risk and fall on our face.
So here we see the callback. Now this is another comedic term that when you've done something funny in the beginning of your set, you then call back to it later on in the set, and you've already built that foundation of humor with the audience. So instead of giving them some cold humor that they've got to work themselves up to, you've already warmed them up with this aspect of humor, and you come back to it. And here we see that coming with we now have Darren falling on his face on the stage again. But this callback, it can be used not just for comedic effect, it can be used for structural effect as well. That when you're delivering a speech, when you introduce an idea, your core message in the beginning of your speech, call back to it later on in your speech, right at the very end of your speech or towards the end of your speech, because then you're going to create this structural arch. Think of it like a bridge. You know, a bridge is shaped like an arch. You then have this structure built throughout your speech of you introduce the audience to a key idea or message. You start to layer in support for that message, the stories that you tell, the metaphors that you share, some data that you might have. You're building that support, and then you anchor it at the end by a callback to that original message, a callback to something that you did at the beginning of the speech. And that's where we're seeing a twofold approach here from Darren. He's doing the callback for a comedic effect, but he's also doing callback for a structural effect to make sure that here at the end, the audience are really getting this message reinforced for them.
We still made.
Do you see that? Do you see the little teapot? So again, this is something that Darren has talked about on his podcast, is that when he did that second fall, his microphone packet fell out of his belt, or fell out of his pocket, I believe. And so as he's getting up, his mic is falling out his pocket, and he just reaches and grabs it and puts it back in again. So you'll see just here on shot, you're going to see that hand go behind his back.
Progress.
There we go. So he puts it back. So this is actually a little bit of a tech malfunction here, but Darren just plays it off seamlessly. And what really helps him to do this, so he's got his mic, he's getting to adjust, but then you looking?
Go ahead and fall.
So I've cut that joke a little bit in terms of where I've paused it, but he falls on his face, he stands up and he says, you've still made progress. From falling, you've still gone forwards. And so he delivers that line and it gets a laugh from the audience. And that gives Darren the time to compose himself. He goes back on stage, he's readjusting his mic, as you can see, putting it back in. And he knows that he doesn't have to say anything. He knows it's not going to be an awkward or clunky break in the speech, because he's told a line and the audience are laughing. This is really fantastic composure from Darren, and it's something that we've got to have when we're on stage. Things like this will happen. Things will go wrong. We'll have slip-ups, tech failures. I was doing Simon Sinek's TED Talk a couple of weeks ago, back on the YouTube channel. I nearly said the podcast there. I was looking at Simon Sinek's TED Talk, and 5 minutes into his speech, someone comes up and swaps his microphone, because the microphone he's been using is pretty poor. And so he has to adjust to being given a microphone while he's on stage. It doesn't faze him, and he still delivers one of the best TED Talks of all time. Here, Darren's mic kit falls out, it doesn't faze him, and he still delivers one of the best World Championship speeches of all time. So this is fantastic composure from Darren, and also understanding that there will be that opportunity in his speech. If he can just keep hold of that mic for another 5 seconds, he's going to be delivering a line that gets a laugh, and as the audience is laughing, he can recompose himself get himself back on stage, ready to round off the speech. Darren talks ad nauseum about how much feedback and how much coaching he needed to make this speech the World Championship speech. If you feel like your speeches need some coaching as well, then I can help you as a public speaking coach. We'll make sure that your speech has all of those showstopper moments, just like Darren had in his speech. As we're going to look at in a few moments, what are those areas that you need to sharpen and improve in order to make sure you're getting the most out of your speaking and out of your speech. To find out more about my coaching and how it can help you, I've put a link to my LinkedIn in the video description below. If you go there, you can send me a connection request, send me a message, tell me a little bit about where your speaking is at right now, what your aspirations are for your speaking, and what are those areas that you're wanting to work on and improve. And we can have a quick chat and decide what types of coaching might be suitable for you and how my coaching can help you. Now, let's look at the rest of Darren's speech and find out how he could remove an ouch or two from his speech. When I'm covering Toastmasters speeches, I always have a slightly different approach and a couple of different rules that I set myself compared to when I'm analyzing some of the other speeches on my channel. And this was actually directly informed and supported by Darren's advice that he gave me. So it's very topical to bring it up in this particular video. When it comes to delivering feedback on Toastmaster speeches, the first thing that I always have in mind is that the Toastmaster is a real everyday person. Unlike other speeches that I might be analyzing on this channel of presidents and celebrities and renowned speakers, Toastmasters are just everyday folks. And I always like to have that in mind and be a little bit more respectful when we're giving feedback on someone who isn't necessarily in the limelight in the same way that some of these politicians and celebrities and world-renowned leaders might be. The second aspect that I think on is that when you have got to the World Championship of Public Speaking, you have worked on this speech so much. Darren has said how many different clubs that he went and delivered this speech to, how much coaching he got. And by the time that you've delivered this speech and you finished it, you kind of want to see the back of it a little bit. It's been so part of your life for so long that the last thing that you want to hear is then more feedback and, well, this is what you could have done, this is what you could have said. You want to say, you know what, I've part the speech and I've done it, and yes, there might be some few areas I could have improved, but I did it to my best at the time. And that actually leads me to my third point, that in terms of doing the best at the time, this speech did win the World Championship of Public Speaking. So it was already a great speech. It already had so many great components. We've talked about that in the video before. And Darren himself has talked about how on his podcast, he delivered this speech 20 years ago. If he was doing it today, would he change things in it? Absolutely, he would. So of course, there's always things you could and would change. Does that mean that you necessarily had to change it in order to have the effect that it did on the day? Well, clearly it didn't have to have those changes because it still had a great effect and it's still well remembered as one of the funniest World Championship speeches. So with all these factors in mind, what I do in terms of my feedback and analysis for areas of improvement on a Toastmasters speech is I just approach it like I would a Toastmasters evaluation in one of our regular club meetings. I'll give one suggestion for the content of the speech, what Darren said, and one suggestion for the delivery of the speech, how Darren said it. So with that caveat out of the way, let's find out what my two suggestions are.
I want to be a comedian. I was met by silence.
I was met by silence. I don't think Darren needed to say that. He'd already acted that out. He said, "Mum, Dad, I want to be a comedian." And we had those about a good 10 seconds where he was actually silent and he just did the facial expressions. And the facial expressions in that silence said so much. And then at the end, just adding on, I was met with silence. Well, we'd already seen that. He'd already shown us he was met by silence. So he didn't need to tell us he was met by silence. And that was only a small kind of 3-second component there. But I think it would have been more effective just to allow that silence to linger and then have the mouthed ouch exactly as he does. Let the silence there do the work. Let the body language do the work, because I think he'd executed that so well. And see if we took out just that little element, those couple of seconds, it might not seem like much, but this actually feeds into the next suggestion that I'm going to give in terms of delivery.
Who do you want to be? What changes do you want to make in your life? So many of us can see.
Who do you want to be? What changes do you want to make in your life? We got a teeny tiny pause to think and process those questions, and then Darren whizzed straight on. One of the things that I've noticed speaking to audiences around the world is that different cultures have different comfort levels with pause. And what I found is that in North America generally doesn't like very long pauses. In Europe, for example, Europe is a bit more comfortable for pause. And see those questions there. Asking those questions in that quick fire way, I actually think are still too fast for a North American audience, but I think they'll be found particularly fast elsewhere in the world who like to have that longer thinking and reflecting time. So Darren's asked us 2 questions, but he hasn't given us time to think about those questions, reflect on those questions. And in a 7-minute speech, of course, time is of the essence. But remember that earlier suggestion that I made about how he could have chipped 2 or 3 seconds off his speech by not saying that he was met by silence? This is where I would reinvest that time. That when he asks those questions, just having that little beat longer, give us time to think and process. If you're going to ask questions as a speaker and you don't give your audience the chance to think on them, to reflect on them, to process them, you might as well not have asked the question at all, because the question isn't having its power. The question isn't getting to the audience's mind. It isn't helping them to think and reflect upon your message. And so I think Darren can do himself some favor and some justice here by he's asking pertinent questions that relate to his message, just giving the audience that little beat longer to think and reflect on them would allow his message to sink in even more. And that's all I've got for Darren. It's kind of nitpicky stuff, in all honesty. As I said, this is a world championship speech. There are only small things to think about, but I think those 2 suggestions about taking out time in one aspect of his speech, reinvesting it in another aspect of his speech, would have just given him that extra couple percentage points. If he was to come and do this speech today, as he said, he would change it himself. Those are potential changes that he would introduce. There are other potential changes that could be introduced as well. But what I think we've really seen here, we've seen the power of self-deprecating humor. Darren utilizes that really well through his speech. We see that stand-up background in terms of understanding some of the techniques of layering the humor, of having callbacks. And the key thing that really allows him to execute this speech is he has that little bit of showmanship. He has that novel thing of falling on his face on stage. But behind that, he's also got the hard work and the feedback of he went and tried that out in multiple places, was getting the feedback on how it landed, and that allowed him to be able to do that mind reading aspect of knowing that the audience would find it a little bit uncomfortable, but he could then work that discomfort and make the message of his speech stronger. A great and funny speech from Darren, and he's still doing it to this day. Decades later, what you've really seen that Darren's been able to do with his World Championship speech is he's been able to build on that, to use it as a foundation, to build momentum, to go and deliver tons of other great speeches throughout history, to help loads of other speakers throughout history. And I'm certainly one of the speakers that he's helped as well. That's what we mean by leaving a legacy with our speeches. This is one 7-minute speech. But that 7-minute speech has allowed Darren to build on his work and build his legacy as a speaker. And that's what we need to aspire to as speakers, is recognizing that any opportunity we have on stage can be that opportunity to leave our mark, make an impact, and leave a legacy.